Marjorie Wilson, once a vibrant and self-reliant woman, now found herself confined to the small guest room of her son's house. After a debilitating hip surgery, she had reluctantly agreed to live with her son, Richard, and his wife, Tiffany. The arrangement had initially been presented as a gesture of love and support, but it didn't take long for Marjorie to realize the truth. Tiffany had no intention of making her feel at home. "Did you spill water again?" Tiffany's sharp voice echoed from the hallway. She appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed and a look of disdain etched across her face. Marjorie, seated in a recliner, flinched at the accusation. I didn't mean to," Marjorie stammered, her voice trembling. She had been attempting to pour herself a glass of water when her shaky hands betrayed her. "Didn't mean to?" Tiffany scoffed. "Every day it's something with you. You can't expect me to clean up after you like a child." Marjorie lowered her gaze, the words slicing through her already fragile confidence. Richard was rarely home, always busy with work, leaving her alone with Tiffany for hours on end. Each day brought new insults, new ways for Tiffany to remind her how much of a burden she had become. That night, as Marjorie lay in her bed staring at the cracked ceiling, tears rolled down her face. She thought of her late husband, who had always treated her with kindness and respect. She had never imagined her life would come to this, a prisoner in a house that was supposed to be her sanctuary. The only reprieve came from her neighbor, Danielle Carter, a warm and perceptive young woman who worked as a social worker. Danielle often waved from her porch or stopped by to check in on Marjorie. Over time, Danielle began to notice the subtle changes in her elderly neighbor's demeanor, the fading smile, the hesitance in her voice, the deep sadness in her eyes. One afternoon, Danielle brought over a pot of homemade chicken soup. "I thought you might enjoy something warm," she said with a gentle smile. Marjorie accepted the offering with gratitude, her hands trembling as she clutched the bowl. "Thank you, Danielle. You're very kind." As they sat together at the small dining table, Danielle gently probed, "How are you doing, Marjorie?" "Really?" Marjorie hesitated, her eyes darting toward the hallway where she feared Tiffany might appear at any moment. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Danielle didn't press further but made a mental note. Something wasn't right. As she left the house that day, she resolved to keep a closer watch on her elderly neighbor. Later that week, Danielle's suspicions were confirmed. She overheard Tiffany berating Marjorie through an open window. The cruelty in Tiffany's words ignited a sense of urgency in Danielle. This wasn't just a case of a difficult living situation, this was abuse. From that moment, Danielle knew she had to act. Marjorie's suffering could no longer remain hidden. Danielle Carter stood on her porch, her mind replaying the harsh words she had overheard from Tiffany. It wasn't just the tone of her voice, but the defeat in Marjorie's silence that struck Danielle. She had spent years as a social worker advocating for the vulnerable, but this was different. This was personal. The next morning, Danielle decided to visit Marjorie under the pretense of sharing a fresh loaf of bread she had baked. "I thought you might like this," she said cheerfully, handing over the neatly wrapped package. Marjorie offered a faint smile and invited her in. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Danielle noticed Marjorie's hands trembling as she poured tea. Her frailty wasn't just physical, it was etched into her demeanor. "How have you been feeling, Marjorie?" Danielle asked as they sat at the table. Marjorie hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her cardigan. "Oh, just getting by," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Danielle leaned forward, her tone soft but firm. "Marjorie, I've noticed things. I've heard things. If something is wrong, you can tell me." Tears welled up in Marjorie's eyes, but she quickly dabbed them away with a tissue. "Tiffany, she's under a lot of stress," she said, her voice trembling. "She doesn't mean to be harsh." Danielle frowned. "Harsh isn't the word I'd use, Marjorie. What you're describing is abuse." Marjorie's eyes widened and she shook her head quickly. No, it's not that bad. She doesn't have patience for someone like me." Danielle reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand over Marjorie's. "You don't deserve to be treated like this. Let me help?" Marjorie hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. After a long pause, she whispered, "What can you do?" Danielle's mind raced. Reporting Tiffany to the authorities was an option, but Marjorie's reluctance complicated things. Instead, Danielle decided to take a more covert approach. "I can help document what's happening," she said. "If we have evidence, we can protect you." Marjorie's eyes darted toward the hallway, fear evident in her expression. "You don't know Tiffany. If she finds out..." "She won't," Danielle assured her. "We'll be careful." Over the next few days, Danielle prepared a plan. With Marjorie's reluctant consent, she installed small, discreet cameras in key areas of the house: the kitchen, the living room, and the hallway outside Marjorie's room. She made sure the devices were nearly impossible to detect, hiding them behind picture frames and inside vents. Once the cameras were in place, Danielle coached Marjorie on how to keep calm and act natural. "You don't have to provoke her," she explained. "Just go about your day. The cameras will do the rest." Marjorie nodded, though her anxiety was palpable. "I'm not sure I can do this," she murmured. "You're stronger than you think," Danielle replied, squeezing her hand. "And you're not alone anymore." In the days that followed, the cameras captured more than Danielle had anticipated. Tiffany's sharp words, her cold indifference, and even moments of outright neglect were laid bare. But what shocked Danielle the most were the moments when Tiffany spoke to someone on the phone, her voice low but menacing. "Do you think they'll trace it back to us?" Tiffany whispered in one recording. "I'm telling you, we covered our tracks in Nicaragua. There's no way they can prove anything." Danielle's stomach churned as she listened to the recordings. This wasn't just a case of elder abuse. Tiffany was hiding something far darker. She played the clips for Marjorie, who sat in stunned silence. "I knew she was cruel," Marjorie said, her voice trembling. "But I didn't know she was dangerous." "She is," Danielle said firmly. "But now we have proof." The next step was clear. Danielle needed help. She reached out to August Miller, a retired investigative journalist known for his tenacity and connections. "I have something you need to see," Danielle said when she called him. When August arrived at Danielle's house, she showed him the footage. His sharp eyes narrowed as he watched Tiffany's cold demeanor and listened to her cryptic phone calls. "This woman's hiding a lot," August said, leaning back in his chair. "But if she has ties to crimes in Nicaragua, this could be bigger than we think." Danielle nodded. "I want to help Marjorie, but I also want to make sure Tiffany doesn't get away with whatever she's done." August smiled, his determination matching Danielle's. "Then let's dig deeper. If she has skeletons in her closet, we'll find them." As Danielle and August began their investigation, Marjorie felt a flicker of hope for the first time in years. The battle was just beginning, but she wasn't facing it alone. Danielle and August dove into the evidence with precision, their determination growing as they pieced together the fragments of Tiffany's dark past. The footage from the hidden cameras painted a damning picture of her abusive behavior toward Marjorie. Yet, it was Tiffany's cryptic phone calls that hinted at something much more sinister. "Do you think they'll trace it back to us?" Tiffany's recorded voice echoed through Danielle's laptop. Her tone was sharp, laced with the tension of someone guarding a dangerous secret. August replayed the clip, his brow furrowed. "She's not just worried about being caught for elder abuse. This is something deeper." Together, they began combing through public records and news archives, focusing on any connection Tiffany might have to Nicaragua, as hinted at in her calls. It didn't take long for August's investigative instincts to pay off. He found an article buried in an old Nicaraguan newspaper about a woman named Isabel Montoya, a whistleblower who had nearly died after being poisoned while exposing a corporate fraud scheme. Isabel Montoya, August said, showing Danielle the article. "She survived, but just barely. Spent 5 years in a coma." The article suggests the company involved had links to an American executive who vanished shortly after the scandal broke. Danielle leaned closer to the screen, her stomach twisting. "Tiffany." "It's possible," August said. "The timeline fits. And if she was involved, she may have fled to the US to escape the fallout." Their next step was clear: connect Tiffany to the crime. August tapped into his network of former colleagues, digging up employment records, corporate filings, and even legal documents. The puzzle pieces slowly came together, revealing a woman who had changed her name and erased much of her past to start anew. "Tiffany used to be Teresa Mendez," August explained, showing Danielle a grainy photo from an old company directory. The resemblance was undeniable. She worked as an accountant for the company where Isabel Montoya was poisoned. Shortly after the incident, she disappeared. Danielle felt a chill run down her spine. She's not just an abuser. She's a criminal. Meanwhile, Marjorie was beginning to see the depth of Tiffany's deception. When Danielle and August shared their findings with her, she sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelations pressing down on her frail shoulders. She always spoke about how hard her life was," Marjorie whispered. "I never imagined it was because she was running from something." "Marjorie, this isn't your fault," Danielle said gently. "Tiffany made her choices, and she's been hiding behind you while continuing to hurt others. But now we have the means to stop her." As Danielle and August worked to gather more evidence, Tiffany began to sense that something was amiss. She noticed Marjorie's growing unease and Danielle's increasingly frequent visits. Suspicion turned to paranoia, and Tiffany started keeping a closer watch on both women. One evening, as Danielle was helping Marjorie clean up after dinner, Tiffany cornered her in the kitchen. "You've been spending a lot of time here," she said, her tone icy. "What exactly are you up to?" Danielle met her gaze calmly. "Just helping out a neighbor in need." Tiffany stepped closer, her voice lowering to a threatening whisper. "I know you think you're clever, but don't meddle in things you don't understand." Danielle didn't flinch. "And I know what you're doing, Tiffany. You won't get away with it." The words hung in the air, a silent declaration of war. Danielle knew she had crossed the line, but she also knew she couldn't back down now. Later that night, Tiffany rifled through Marjorie's room while the older woman slept, searching for anything that might reveal what Danielle was up to. She found nothing, but her instincts told her she was being watched. That suspicion turned into certainty when she discovered one of the hidden cameras behind a bookshelf. The following day, Tiffany confronted Marjorie. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed, holding the tiny camera up like a trophy. "Letting that nosy neighbor spy on me?" Marjorie's face went pale. "I didn't, she only wanted to help." "Help?" Tiffany snapped. "You have no idea what you've done. Do you think anyone will believe you over me?" Marjorie trembled under Tiffany's glare, but for the first time she found a sliver of strength. "They will when they see the truth." Tiffany's eyes narrowed and she leaned in close. "If you think for 1 second you can take me down, you're more foolish than I thought." As Tiffany stormed out, Marjorie sat trembling, but her fear was mingled with a newfound resolve. She realized that Danielle and August's determination had sparked something in her, a flicker of hope that perhaps she could fight back after all. Danielle and August meanwhile intensified their efforts, knowing Tiffany would soon retaliate. They prepared a dossier of evidence: the footage, the phone recordings, and the documents linking Tiffany to her past crimes. It was a race against time, and the stakes were growing higher with every passing day. Tiffany's paranoia reached a breaking point. She began monitoring Marjorie's every move, cutting her off from Danielle and even threatening to call the police to accuse Danielle of trespassing. But Danielle and August refused to be intimidated. They were determined to protect Marjorie and expose Tiffany's web of lies. The truth was no longer hidden. It was only a matter of time before it came crashing down around Tiffany, and everyone involved would have to face the consequences. Tiffany paced her living room, clutching the tiny hidden camera she had discovered. The walls of her carefully constructed facade were closing in, and her mind raced with how to regain control. She wasn't just fighting to keep Marjorie under her thumb, she was fighting to keep her past buried. Her paranoia boiled over into action. That evening, she summoned Marjorie to the living room, her voice cold and commanding. "Sit down," she barked. Marjorie shuffled in cautiously, her frail figure trembling under Tiffany's withering glare. Tiffany held up the camera. "Do you know what this is?" Marjorie's lips quivered. She could feel the storm brewing but remained silent. "This," Tiffany hissed, "is what your little friend Danielle has been using to spy on me. Did you think I wouldn't find it? Did you think I'd let you and your pathetic little crusade destroy me?" Marjorie's voice shook as she replied, "I only wanted her to help." "Help?" Tiffany's laughter was sharp and bitter. "You think anyone will believe a frail old woman and a nosy neighbor over me? You don't even have your own son on your side." Marjorie flinched at the mention of Richard. He had grown distant, oblivious to his mother's suffering, always believing Tiffany's lies about Marjorie being forgetful and difficult. Tiffany leaned in closer, her tone dropping to a menacing whisper. "If you and Danielle don't back off, I'll make sure you both regret it. I can make things disappear, Marjorie, people too." The threat hung in the air like a noxious cloud. Marjorie swallowed hard, her heart pounding, but somewhere deep inside, the embers of resistance began to glow brighter. Meanwhile, Danielle was unaware of the immediate danger brewing inside Tiffany's house. She had spent the day with August, compiling their growing file of evidence against Tiffany. The phone recordings, the footage of abuse, and the documents tying Tiffany to her crimes in Nicaragua were now organized in a secure folder, ready to be handed over to the authorities. "You think she suspects anything?" August asked, his voice steady but concerned. Danielle nodded grimly. "She's smart, August. She found one of the cameras, but we still have enough footage from the others. The bigger issue now is protecting Marjorie." August leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the table. "We need to act fast. If Tiffany's as dangerous as we think, she won't go down without a fight." That evening, Danielle stopped by Marjorie's house to check in, but Tiffany intercepted her at the door. "You're not welcome here," Tiffany said, her voice dripping with venom. "I'm here to see Marjorie," Danielle replied firmly. "She doesn't need you meddling in her life," Tiffany spat. "You've caused enough trouble." Danielle stood her ground. "I think Marjorie can decide for herself." Tiffany smirked and leaned against the doorframe. "You're playing with fire, Danielle. Walk away before you get burned." Danielle's heart raced, but she refused to show fear. "And you should think about what happens when the truth comes out. You won't be able to threaten your way out of this." Tiffany's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "We'll see about that." Danielle turned and walked away, her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew Tiffany's threats weren't empty, and she resolved to keep a closer eye on Marjorie. Inside the house, Tiffany's fury simmered. She began plotting her next move, knowing she needed to dismantle the growing case against her. She scoured Marjorie's room, searching for any other devices Danielle might have planted. When she found nothing, she turned her attention to Danielle herself. The following day, Danielle received an anonymous text. "Stay out of this or you'll regret it." She showed the message to August, her face pale but determined. "She's getting desperate," Danielle said. "That means we're close to breaking her." "Desperation makes people dangerous," August warned. "We need to be ready for anything." True to his prediction, Tiffany escalated her tactics. She filed a false police report, accusing Danielle of trespassing and harassment. Officers arrived at Danielle's home, questioning her about Tiffany's claims. "This is retaliation," Danielle explained, showing them the evidence she had gathered. While the officers didn't press charges, the incident rattled Danielle and reminded her of the stakes. Meanwhile, Tiffany tried to manipulate Richard into taking her side. "Your mother and Danielle are conspiring against me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "They've been spying on me, trying to make me look like a monster." Richard hesitated, torn between loyalty to his wife and the gnawing suspicion that there was more to the story. "I'll talk to Danielle," he said finally. When Richard confronted Danielle, she laid everything on the table. She played the recordings, showed him the footage, and presented the evidence linking Tiffany to crimes in Nicaragua. Richard's face paled as he processed the revelations. "I knew she could be harsh," he admitted, his voice shaking. "But this is unthinkable." "It's the truth," Danielle said. "And your mother needs you." Richard's guilt was evident, but before he could act, Tiffany struck again. She confronted Marjorie in a final attempt to silence her. "If you testify against me," Tiffany snarled, "I'll make sure Danielle loses everything. Her career, her reputation, it'll all be gone. And you'll wish you'd never been born." But this time Marjorie didn't crumble. Instead, she straightened in her chair, her voice steady and clear. "You can threaten me all you want, Tiffany. I'm done being afraid of you." Tiffany's eyes narrowed, her fury barely contained. "You'll regret this," she spat before storming out. Marjorie sat alone in the quiet house, her heart pounding. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. With Danielle and August's support, she knew she had the strength to fight back. Danielle and August knew they needed reinforcements. Tiffany's escalating threats made it clear she was willing to go to extreme lengths to protect her secrets. They decided it was time to rally the community to support Marjorie and push for justice. The following weekend, Danielle hosted a small gathering at her home, inviting trusted neighbors who had long admired Marjorie. Among them was Claire, a retired nurse, Mike, a local handyman, and Sarah, a schoolteacher who often stopped by to chat with Marjorie. Danielle stood in front of the group, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to reveal. "I've asked you all here because Marjorie needs our help. She's been suffering in silence for too long, and the person responsible has gone too far." She played a short compilation of the footage from the hidden cameras, showing Tiffany's cruel treatment of Marjorie. Gasps and murmurs of disbelief rippled through the room. "I can't believe this," Claire said, her voice trembling. "She always seemed so polished. How could she do this?" Danielle explained the scope of Tiffany's abuse and hinted at the criminal activities they were uncovering. "We have enough evidence to go to the authorities, but we need to ensure Marjorie is safe and supported in the meantime." The group agreed unanimously to stand by Marjorie. They devised a plan to keep her protected. Claire offered to check in daily to monitor Marjorie's health, Mike volunteered to repair the door locks and install a security system, and Sarah promised to accompany Marjorie to any appointments or meetings with officials. Meanwhile, August continued digging deeper into Tiffany's past. His latest discovery was a testament to the depth of her criminal activities. Using his network of international contacts, he uncovered documents that directly tied Tiffany, formerly Teresa Mendez, to a fraudulent real estate scheme in Nicaragua. The scheme had left dozens of families homeless and had culminated in the attempted murder of Isabel Montoya, the whistleblower who had exposed it. "Look at this," August said, spreading the documents across Danielle's dining table. Bank transfers, property deeds, and even a statement from one of her former colleagues who claims Tiffany orchestrated the whole thing. Danielle stared at the papers in awe. "This is it. This is what we need to bring her down." But Tiffany was not oblivious to the growing resistance. She began noticing the neighbors' increased presence around Marjorie's home and overheard snippets of conversations that made her blood boil. The walls were closing in and Tiffany grew desperate. One evening, she approached Marjorie in a rare moment of faux sincerity. "I know things have been tense," Tiffany said, her tone unusually soft. "Maybe we've misunderstood each other. Let's try to make things work." Marjorie, wary of the sudden change in demeanor, replied cautiously, "I've always wanted things to work, Tiffany." But as soon as Marjorie let her guard down, Tiffany's mask slipped. "Then you'll tell Danielle to back off. If you don't, I promise you'll regret it." Marjorie met Tiffany's gaze, her newfound courage burning bright. "No, I won't." Across the street, Danielle and August finalized their plan to involve law enforcement. They gathered their evidence, videos, phone recordings, and the damning documents linking Tiffany to crimes in Nicaragua. August contacted a trusted friend in the local police department, Detective Maria Lawson, who had a reputation for handling sensitive cases with integrity. Detective Lawson reviewed the material with a grim expression. "This is solid. We'll need to coordinate with federal authorities if this ties to international crimes, but I'll make sure Marjorie gets immediate protection." The next day, Detective Lawson arrived at Tiffany's house with a warrant. Tiffany greeted her with feigned politeness, but her eyes darted nervously as the detective explained the purpose of her visit. "This is ridiculous," Tiffany said, her voice shaking. "You have no right to invade my home." Detective Lawson remained unfazed. "We have substantial evidence of your involvement in abuse and financial crimes, both domestic and international. You'll need to come with us for questioning." Tiffany's carefully crafted world began to crumble as officers searched her home, uncovering additional incriminating evidence. Meanwhile, the neighborhood rallied around Marjorie, ensuring she felt safe and supported during the unfolding investigation. That evening, Marjorie sat in Danielle's living room, surrounded by friends and allies who had come together to fight for her. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of belonging and safety. Danielle sat beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "This is just the beginning, Marjorie. You're not alone anymore." As Tiffany's arrest made local headlines, the community's solidarity grew stronger. People who had once turned a blind eye began to step forward, sharing their own stories of witnessing Tiffany's cruelty or suspecting something was amiss. What had started as a quiet battle for justice was becoming a movement, one that Marjorie never imagined she would be a part of. But as the legal process began, Marjorie knew the hardest part was still ahead, testifying against the woman who had tormented her and confronting the shadows of her past. She drew strength from the faces around her, determined to see the fight through to the end. Tiffany's arrest sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. For most of Marjorie's life, she had believed the worst confrontations were behind her. Yet, the fallout from Tiffany's exposure was only beginning. The legal proceedings loomed large, and tensions were at an all-time high as Marjorie prepared to face her tormentor in court. While Tiffany was initially held in custody, her attorney secured her release on bail. She returned to the house like a storm, slamming doors and muttering under her breath. Danielle and August had anticipated her release but weren't prepared for the level of audacity Tiffany displayed. Instead of retreating, she doubled down on her threats. "You think this is over?" Tiffany sneered one evening as she cornered Marjorie in the kitchen. "I still have friends, people who owe me favors. Do you really think a frail old woman and her nosy neighbor can beat me?" Marjorie's pulse quickened, but her newfound strength remained intact. "It's not just Danielle," she replied, her voice steady. "You've hurt too many people and now the truth is out." Tiffany's smirk faltered, but she quickly recovered. "We'll see how far that truth gets when I drag you all down with me." The next day, Danielle and August convened with Detective Maria Lawson to discuss the mounting threats. "She's not going to stop," Danielle said, her frustration evident. "Tiffany's desperate, and that makes her dangerous. She's playing a game she can't win," August added. "But we can't underestimate her." Detective Lawson nodded. "We're monitoring her movements closely, but you're right to be cautious. Make sure Marjorie is never alone." Despite the precautions, Tiffany was determined to undermine the case against her. She tampered with the locks on Marjorie's room and sabotaged the security system Mike had installed. One night, Marjorie awoke to find Tiffany standing in her doorway, a sinister silhouette against the dim light of the hallway. "You've ruined everything," Tiffany hissed. "Do you think you'll come out of this unscathed?" Marjorie's breath caught, but she summoned the courage to respond. "I won't let you intimidate me anymore." Tiffany took a step closer, but the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her. Danielle appeared behind her, her presence startling Tiffany into retreating. "Leave her alone, Tiffany," Danielle said firmly. The next morning, Danielle and August held a meeting with the core group of neighbors who had been supporting Marjorie. "It's time to take this to the next level," Danielle said. "Tiffany's pushing back harder than ever, and we need to make sure she can't retaliate." The group agreed to intensify their support. Claire, the retired nurse, began spending nights at Marjorie's house to provide constant protection. Sarah, the schoolteacher, organized a community letter-writing campaign to local officials, urging them to expedite the case against Tiffany. Meanwhile, August made a breakthrough in his investigation. He uncovered a hidden bank account linked to Tiffany, where large sums of money had been funneled from her fraudulent schemes in Nicaragua. This evidence, combined with the testimonies of Marjorie and others, gave the case against Tiffany significant weight. But Tiffany wasn't finished. Desperation drove her to confront Danielle directly. One evening she showed up unannounced at Danielle's home, her face a mask of false calm. "You've got quite the savior complex, don't you?" Tiffany said, stepping into the porch light. "Always trying to rescue the weak and helpless." Danielle crossed her arms, unflinching. "You should leave, Tiffany. You're not welcome here." Tiffany stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You think you've won, but I promise you this isn't over. People like me always find a way out." Danielle met her glare, her voice unwavering. "Not this time. Your lies, your crimes, they've caught up with you. And no one's afraid of you anymore." Tiffany's composure cracked and she lunged toward Danielle, but before she could lay a hand on her, August appeared behind her, holding up his phone. "Smile for the camera, Tiffany. You just added assault to your list of charges?" Tiffany froze, her rage palpable. She turned and stormed off, muttering curses under her breath. Danielle and August exchanged a look of relief and determination. They knew they were close to bringing Tiffany down for good. As the community rallied behind Marjorie, Tiffany's once intimidating presence began to wane. The collective strength of those she had hurt, and those determined to protect Marjorie, became an unstoppable force. Yet, Marjorie knew the hardest battle lay ahead, facing Tiffany in court and sharing her story in front of strangers. The stage was set for the trial, where the truth would finally come to light, and justice would have its chance to prevail. The courthouse loomed tall and foreboding as Marjorie stepped out of the car, her frail hand gripping Danielle's arm for support. The crowd outside buzzed with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. The headlines about Tiffany's arrest and her alleged crimes had stirred public interest, but for Marjorie this was personal. Danielle squeezed her arm gently. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. Marjorie nodded, drawing strength from her neighbor's unwavering support. Inside, the courtroom was a clash of tension and formality. Tiffany sat at the defendant's table, her polished appearance and composed demeanor a stark contrast to the evidence piled against her. Her attorney leaned in to whisper something, but Tiffany's eyes were fixed on Marjorie, her gaze a silent threat. Marjorie took her seat beside Danielle and August, her heart pounding. She had prepared herself for this moment, but the weight of years of torment threatened to overwhelm her. Yet, as the proceedings began, she found herself clinging to the determination that had carried her this far. The prosecution began by laying out the case against Tiffany. Danielle's recordings were played, filling the courtroom with the venomous sound of Tiffany's voice berating Marjorie. Gasps rippled through the audience as they listened to Tiffany's threats, her cruelty undeniable. Detective Maria Lawson testified next, presenting the financial records August had uncovered. The defendant, using the alias Teresa Mendez, orchestrated fraudulent real estate deals in Nicaragua, embezzling millions from vulnerable families. When Isabel Montoya, a whistleblower, exposed her, she attempted to silence her through poisoning, Lawson explained. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecution displayed photos of Isabel Montoya before and after the attack. The stark contrast between the vibrant young woman and the fragile survivor struck a nerve. August's research had connected the dots, tying Tiffany's past crimes to her present life of manipulation and abuse. When it was Marjorie's turn to testify, the room seemed to hold its breath. She steadied herself as she approached the witness stand, her cane tapping softly against the floor. Once seated, she looked out at the courtroom, her gaze finding Danielle and August. Their encouraging nods gave her the courage to begin. 4 years I lived under Tiffany's roof, Marjorie said, her voice trembling but clear. I thought I was a burden, that her treatment of me was somehow my fault. But now I see it for what it was, abuse. She recounted the verbal assaults, the isolation, the fear. Tears welled in her eyes as she described nights spent crying alone, afraid of what Tiffany might do next. She made me feel small, insignificant. But I'm here today to say I won't be silenced anymore. The defense tried to discredit Marjorie, suggesting she was senile or exaggerating the extent of the abuse. But Marjorie's quiet dignity and the overwhelming evidence against Tiffany made their arguments ring hollow. As the trial continued, more witnesses came forward. Former neighbors, estate employees, and even Tiffany's estranged friends testified about her manipulative nature and suspicious behavior over the years. Each testimony chipped away at the facade Tiffany had built, leaving her increasingly isolated. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful. Tiffany, or Teresa, Mendez has spent her life exploiting and harming others for her own gain, the attorney said, gesturing toward Marjorie. But her greatest mistake was underestimating the strength of those she thought she had broken. Today we stand together to hold her accountable. In a last-ditch effort, Tiffany's attorney painted her as a victim of circumstance, claiming she had acted out of desperation. But the jury's expressions revealed their skepticism. The verdict came 2 days later. The jury found Tiffany guilty on multiple counts, including elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. As the judge read the sentence, 20 years in prison, Tiffany's mask finally cracked. Her face contorted with rage as she was led out of the courtroom, her eyes blazing with hatred as they locked onto Marjorie. But Marjorie felt no fear. For the first time in years she felt free. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered to celebrate the verdict. Marjorie was greeted with hugs, words of encouragement, and a renewed sense of belonging. Danielle stood beside her, tears of pride shining in her eyes. You did it, Danielle said softly. You stood up to her. Marjorie nodded, her own tears falling freely. I couldn't have done it alone. As the crowd dispersed, August approached with a warm smile. You're a hero, Marjorie, he said. Your strength gave others the courage to speak up. Marjorie looked at the people surrounding her, the neighbors who had rallied, the friends who had stayed by her side. For the first time she felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by a newfound sense of hope and purpose. The courthouse steps buzzed with activity as reporters jotted notes and community members exchanged proud smiles. Marjorie, standing alongside Danielle and August, felt the warm sun on her face, a stark contrast to the weight she had carried for years. But even as the verdict provided a sense of closure, Marjorie knew her journey wasn't over. In the days following Tiffany's conviction, the focus shifted to rebuilding Marjorie's life. The house where she had endured years of torment no longer felt like a home. Danielle and the community rallied to help her transition to a brighter future. We found a lovely senior living complex nearby, Danielle said one afternoon as she handed Marjorie a pamphlet. It's not just a place to live, it's a community. You'll be surrounded by people who care. Marjorie looked at the pamphlet, her hand trembling slightly. The idea of starting over felt daunting, but it also sparked something she hadn't felt in years: hope. I think I'd like that, Marjorie said softly. It's time for a new chapter. As Marjorie prepared to move, the neighbors who had once been mere acquaintances became her staunchest allies. Mike installed security cameras around her new apartment, ensuring she'd always feel safe. Claire, the retired nurse, offered to visit weekly to check on her health. Sarah, the schoolteacher, brought books and puzzles to keep her mind engaged. Even Richard, Marjorie's son, began to reconcile with his mother. Seeing the evidence of Tiffany's cruelty had shattered his illusions, leaving him consumed by guilt. He visited Marjorie at her new home, bringing flowers and heartfelt apologies. I should have seen it, Mom, Richard said, his voice cracking. I should have protected you. Marjorie placed a hand on his, her eyes kind. You can't change the past, Richard. But we can move forward. Meanwhile, August continued to unravel the web of crimes Tiffany had left behind. His latest article, published in a major newspaper, detailed the extent of her schemes in Nicaragua and the lives she had destroyed. The piece not only brought justice to Tiffany's victims but also highlighted Marjorie's courage in standing up to her abuser. The article gained widespread attention, inspiring others to speak out against abuse and exploitation. Danielle received calls from people across the city, thanking her for her work and asking how they could help their own vulnerable loved ones. Marjorie, too, found herself in the spotlight. She was invited to speak at community events and senior advocacy groups, sharing her story of survival and resilience. Though public speaking didn't come naturally to her, she discovered that her voice had power, a power Tiffany had tried to silence but never truly could. At one event, Marjorie stood before a packed room, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "For years I believed I was powerless," she began. "But I've learned that even the smallest voice can make a difference when it's supported by others. I'm here today because people believed in me, and I hope my story helps someone else find their strength." The room erupted in applause and Marjorie felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. She wasn't just a victim, she was a survivor, a symbol of hope for others. As the weeks turned into months, Marjorie's life blossomed in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her days were filled with laughter and companionship, her nights free of fear. She developed close friendships with her neighbors at the senior living complex, joining a book club and even trying her hand at painting. Danielle visited often, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. "You've come so far," Danielle said one afternoon as they strolled through the complex's garden. "I couldn't have done it without you," Marjorie replied. "You saved me, Danielle." Danielle smiled, shaking her head. "No, Marjorie. You saved yourself. I just reminded you how strong you already were." The shadows of Tiffany's reign were fading, replaced by the light of a new beginning. Though the scars of the past would always remain, Marjorie had reclaimed her life, proving that resilience and community could overcome even the darkest of times. Marjorie sat in the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly together, her gaze fixed on the judge as the final stages of Tiffany's trial unfolded. Though Tiffany's guilt had been firmly established, the sentencing phase brought its own challenges. It was a chance for both sides to speak, and Tiffany, ever the manipulator, seized the opportunity to attempt one last grasp at sympathy. Her lawyer addressed the court first. "My client acknowledges her mistakes," he began, his voice smooth and measured. "But let us not forget that she, too, is a product of difficult circumstances. Mercy is not only for the victims but for those who have lost their way." Tiffany, seated beside him, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her crocodile tears failing to move the stoic judge. Marjorie felt a knot tighten in her stomach. For years, she had witnessed Tiffany weaponize her charm and cunning to manipulate others. Now, in front of the court, she was doing it again. The prosecutor rose next, presenting a searing rebuttal. "Tiffany, or Teresa Mendez, is not a woman who simply lost her way. She is a woman who chose time and again to exploit, manipulate, and harm others for her personal gain. Her actions have caused irreparable damage, not only to Marjorie Wilson but to countless others, from Nicaragua to right here in this community." As the prosecutor spoke, Danielle leaned over and whispered to Marjorie, "You've already done the hardest part. Now it's time to finish this." When the judge called for victim impact statements, Marjorie's name was the first to be read. Her heart pounded as she rose from her seat, her cane steadying her as she walked to the stand. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on her. "I am here today because I survived," Marjorie began, her voice clear but heavy with emotion. "For years I lived under Tiffany's roof, believing I was nothing more than a burden. She stripped me of my dignity, my confidence, and my hope. But today I am here to take all of that back." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom before settling on Tiffany. "You tried to break me. You told me I was worthless. But I am not worthless. I am stronger than you ever gave me credit for. And I hope, wherever you end up, you take the time to reflect on the pain you've caused, not just to me but to everyone whose lives you've shattered." Marjorie returned to her seat, the room buzzing with hushed murmurs of admiration and respect. Danielle squeezed her hand, her own eyes brimming with tears. "You were incredible," she whispered. The judge called for a recess before delivering the final sentence. During the break, Marjorie found herself surrounded by supporters, neighbors, activists, and even strangers who had been following the case. Each word of encouragement felt like a salve, mending the wounds Tiffany had inflicted. When the court reconvened, the judge delivered her decision with gravity and precision. "This court finds Tiffany Mendez guilty of elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. Given the severity of these crimes, the harm caused to her victims, and her lack of genuine remorse, I am sentencing her to 25 years in state prison." A collective breath swept through the room. Tiffany's carefully crafted composure finally crumbled as she erupted in protest. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice shrill. "I was framed. You'll all regret this." The bailiff moved swiftly, restraining her as she was escorted out of the courtroom. Marjorie watched her go, the weight of Tiffany's words barely touching her. For the first time in years she felt light, free. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers as the news spread. Marjorie stood at the center of it all, a quiet smile gracing her face. The fight was over and justice had prevailed. Danielle and August flanked her as they made their way through the throng of supporters. "How do you feel?" Danielle asked. Marjorie took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air. "Like I can finally breathe again." That evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, Marjorie sat on her porch with Danielle and August. The three of them sipped tea, the weight of the day giving way to a peaceful quiet. "You've done more than survive, Marjorie," August said. "You've shown everyone that it's never too late to fight back." Marjorie nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "And I hope it helps others find their strength. No one should have to suffer in silence." The battle had been hard fought, but Marjorie knew it was the beginning of something bigger. Her story, once hidden in the shadows, had become a beacon of hope, shining light into the lives of those who needed it most. The days following Tiffany's sentencing felt like a quiet storm passing. Marjorie, once a prisoner in her own home, now stood on the threshold of a life she thought she'd never have. A life of peace, safety, and community. As she settled into her new apartment at the senior living complex, she felt an unfamiliar sensation blooming within her: hope. Danielle helped Marjorie unpack her belongings, carefully placing framed photos of Marjorie's late husband and her son on the shelves. The apartment was small but bright, with sunlight streaming through large windows that overlooked a garden courtyard. "It's lovely here," Marjorie said softly, running her fingers along the edge of a polished oak table. "I never thought I'd have a place that feels like mine again." Danielle smiled. "You deserve it, Marjorie. You've fought harder than anyone I know." The senior living community quickly welcomed Marjorie with open arms. Her neighbors, many of whom had their own stories of hardship and resilience, embraced her as one of their own. She joined a book club, attended weekly bingo nights, and even tried yoga, much to her own amusement. "You'd have laughed if you saw me," Marjorie told Danielle during one of their visits. "I nearly toppled over trying to do a warrior pose." Danielle laughed. "You're braver than I am. I'd never have the nerve to try yoga." Though Marjorie's days were now filled with companionship and joy, she never forgot the fight that had brought her here. She continued to speak at community events, her story inspiring others to confront abuse and advocate for justice. Each time she shared her journey, she felt lighter, as though the act of telling her truth released the final remnants of Tiffany's hold on her. At one event, a young woman approached Marjorie after her speech. "Hearing you speak gave me the courage to leave a bad situation," the woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for showing me it's possible." Marjorie's eyes welled with tears as she hugged the woman. "You're stronger than you know," she said. "I'm just glad I could help." Danielle and August remained constant fixtures in Marjorie's life. The three of them often met for coffee, their bond deepened by the battle they had fought together. August, ever the storyteller, was busy working on a book about Tiffany's crimes and Marjorie's courage. "People need to know what you did," he told her. "Your story is a reminder that it's never too late to stand up for yourself." As the months passed, even Marjorie's relationship with her son, Richard, began to heal. He visited often, bringing her flowers and taking her to lunch. Though guilt still lingered in his eyes, Marjorie assured him she held no resentment. "We all make mistakes, Richard," she said one afternoon. "What matters is that we learn from them." One crisp autumn evening, the senior living complex hosted a community dinner. Marjorie sat at a table surrounded by friends, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses filling the air. Danielle and August arrived later, taking seats beside her. "You look happy," Danielle observed, her own heart swelling with pride at the sight of Marjorie's contentment. "I am," Marjorie replied, her smile radiant. "I never thought I'd feel this way again, but here I am. Life has a way of surprising you." As the evening drew to a close, Marjorie stood to address the room. "I want to thank all of you for welcoming me and showing me the kindness I didn't think I deserved," she said, her voice steady. "But most of all, I want to thank those who stood by me when I couldn't stand for myself. Danielle, August, and so many others, you reminded me that I wasn't alone. And because of that, I found the strength to take my life back." The room erupted in applause and Marjorie sat down, her heart full. She realized that the battle she had fought wasn't just about escaping Tiffany's abuse. It was about rediscovering her worth and rebuilding her sense of self. As she walked back to her apartment that night, the crisp autumn air filling her lungs, Marjorie felt truly free. She looked up at the stars, a small smile playing on her lips. "I did it," she whispered. "I finally did it. And for the first time in years, Marjorie didn't feel like a survivor. She felt like a thriver. What do you think about Marjorie's journey? Would you have taken the same steps she did to reclaim your life? Share your thoughts below. If Marjorie's story inspired you, don't forget to like this story and share it with someone who needs a little hope today. And be sure to subscribe for more tales of resilience and transformation.